Okay. Ms. Haley suggested when we pick a topic that it be something that interested us in our studies. So in true nerd form, I got interested in genetics through 3 different classes that I took over the course of the past year. We as humans share 99.9% of our genetics, which means we're basically made out of the same stuff, which makes us a lot like baked goods. We have 2 very different things here that are made out of basically the same stuff. And as us, actually, odd fun fact, I learned from howstuffworks.com, we share 41% of our DNA with a banana. Who knew? But it's that 0.1% of difference that's like the subtle variation in recipes that accounts for the variations that make us who we are. And so today I'm going to explain 5 terms or concepts for you. Alleles, genotypes, phenotypes, endophenotypes, and epigenetics. And I'm going to explain them to you using either ingredients or steps in a recipe as an analogy. Now, this is the Colorado Kosh cookbook. It's full of recipes for baked goods. And as you can see, in a recipe, you have 3 things. You have your list of ingredients, you have mixing instructions, and you have baking instructions. And that's kind of how genetics works, a little bit, sort of. The first part, ingredients. Sorry if my handwriting's a little messy. That's our alleles and our genotypes. Alleles, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, are like our pantry ingredients. They're the tiniest bits of genetic coding that control for simple traits like our eye color, our hair texture, and certain disorders like Down syndrome and Huntington's disease. Stanford EDU describes genotypes as groups of alleles that are more like a specific proportions of ingredients in our recipes that control more complex traits, like, they influence more complex traits, like our height and build, temperament, IQ capacity, and certain, the potential for certain neurological and personality disorders. The next part is the mixing instructions. And that's more of our phenotypes and our endophenotypes. It determines what kind of a thing. Our ingredients just give us the potential of what might get made. The mixing instructions are going to determine what it is that gets made. If you, let's take for instance butter. If you melt butter and mix it into a batter, you might get waffles or pancake batter. If you whip it up with your wet ingredients, you'll get something fluffier, like a cake or a muffin. And if you cut it cold into flour, you'll get something like a crumbly biscuit or flaky pastry. In my ABSCITE text, I learned that phenotypes are manifestations of the different genotypes. It's how they appear when they're mixed up a certain way. If you were to go down to Bakery Hill and get yourself a muffin, you would know you have a muffin. You wouldn't necessarily know what's in the muffin, all the ingredients or what proportions that they're in. And that's kind of like how we don't know what genotypes that we have, we know what phenotypes we display. I have a very short mom. She's 5 foot even. My dad is 6'4". I'm on the tall side. And so we know basically what my phenotype is for height. We don't know what my capacity is, my potential is, until I had a son who ended up being 6'6". Then, I have that in there. Other examples of phenotypes would be whether you have blue or brown eyes, or the presentation of certain genetic disorders. The last thing not last thing, but endophenotypes are similar but more complicated to phenotypes. They are subtraits or lesser forms of a disease or disorder that can actually be an indicator of risk factors that if somebody in your family has them, that you might end up with a certain kind of disease or disorder like schizophrenia or autism. So we have, let's do it in the middle here. All right, so we've got me. I'm kind of a chewy, nutty granola cookie. I have ADHD. And then we have my husband. He's terribly socially awkward, and he is a creature of routine, which are autism spectrum traits, but they don't cause him significant distress. So by the DSM, he wouldn't be diagnosed with anything. But they are autism spectrum traits. He's kind of a carrot cake sort of person. My father had a lot of autism spectrum traits. He was very rigid with his routines. He had a lot of sensory issues. Had he been born 40 or 50 years later, he probably would have been diagnosed as being on the spectrum, but back in the 50s and 60s, Bob was just a little bit odd. Then we have my husband's mom, she has sensory issues. She doesn't like any food with flavor in it. Her diet is mostly plain chicken and boiled vegetables. I looked in her spice cabinet once, literally it was salt. That was it. She hates the taste of onion, she hates the taste of garlic. She also has some obsessive compulsive behaviors, but again, because they don't cause distress, by DSM she wouldn't be considered OCD. And then we have her mother, who is a complete and total fruitcake.
Gosh.
And we have no idea what kinds of nuts, fruits, and spices passed from her to her daughter to her son and eventually to my children. But we know that my genotype and his genotype got together, and my oldest son has autism. So that's the mixing instructions and the ingredients. And I'm not done with the marker yet. And that's upside down. So, the last thing on our list is the baking or cooking instructions. I'm going to equate this to epigenetics, which is how the environment works on your DNA but doesn't change it. And this can happen before or after birth. With baked goods, your oven has to be at the right temperature. You have to use the right kind of pan. Preferably you would have no toxic material burning in your oven. No funky smells. And while a baby is in utero, you want the mother to have a healthy diet. You want her to have a healthy lifestyle, very little stress, obviously not doing drugs. Those are things that would affect the baby's genetics. And then, baked goods are delicate things once they're out of the oven. They need to cool in a particular way to develop a crispy cookie or, a nice crust on a loaf of bread. And then once they're done, they have to be packaged and handled in a way that's they're fairly delicate. And newborns are also very delicate, and they're not done just because they've been born. Serotonin and dopamine are very important to adults. Cuddling, nurturing, hugging, it helps us regulate serotonin and dopamine in our brains and helps keep us kind of sane and happy. With babies, it's more than that. It affects how their brains grow structurally. And if babies aren't nurtured and cuddled, their brains actually won't grow properly, which can cause emotional, behavioral, and cognitive dysfunction. So it's very important that babies get that.